I'm going to get to where I can drop it in the chat box here. So hopefully you can get it that way. If I can find it. All right, so that should be now showing in the chat box for you to download if you did not get it. I think if you're on a phone, it might not be there, but if you're on your computer, you should be able to download that. All right. So here's the idea of today is we're going to go through and we're going to talk about the exclusive right to sell, listing agreement, all the paperwork that you need when you are working with a seller. And the idea of this is ultimately what I'm wanting to do is explain it to you so that you'll know how to fill it out when you go and get a listing. So here's where we're going to start with is, and I guess, would it be helpful? Maybe I'll just throw it in. Let me pull it up on the, I'm going to pull it up on the screen so you guys can see it here. Give me 1 second again, sorry. You're just going to have to remind me to scroll on here, probably for you guys if you don't have the paperwork. All right, almost there. All right, hopefully you can see that then if you didn't have the printout. All right, here we go. So here's what I want you to notice. The very first thing, and this was actually a number of years before I really noticed this on this exclusive right to sell listing agreement, is if you'll notice there in the bold, underneath where it says exclusive right to sell listing agreement and agency disclosure, it says, this is a legally binding contract. Read carefully before signing. Now, I had been in the business a number of years. I had used this form. I had that on there. I had taught this class actually even a number of times. And one day we had an attorney that worked for the company that I was with, and he had come in and was part of the class. And I started and just said, okay, let's start where it says the agreement is entitled, this agreement is entered into and effective. And he said, hold on, that's not where the contract starts. It actually starts above that. And he pointed out that it says this is a legally binding contract, which of course an attorney is going to want to point that out. But here was what his point was, is because this is a legally binding contract, the client needs to understand that. And so for you, if your client were to say, I want to have an attorney look at it or something, then you should let them. Now, here's the other piece of this that I would say is, and I've talked about this a couple of times, but I helped my sister just buy a property, and we closed last week actually. And what happened though is that the tenant was having a hard time finding someplace. And we were going to just say, well, too bad, there's still just need to be out. They've given enough notice and all those things. But what ended up happening was my sister, with her down payment, she was getting a check from her retirement and it had not come yet. And so as a result, the lender was saying, we're probably going to need to push back our settlement deadline because once she gets the check, it's probably going to have to sit in her bank for a few days before it'll be good funds. And we can use it. Well, rather than going to the seller and saying, hey, we need an extension, and explaining to them that it was because we were waiting on this down payment, I didn't want to panic them. So instead, I went to the seller and said, hey, we're not in a rush to get this closed. So if the tenant does need an extra week, we're fine to give them that extra week to find someplace to live. Well, the seller came back and was so excited and happy because yes, the tenant's having a hard time and they promised they'll be out at that point, and great. So at that point, then we do an extension. and we send over saying settlement deadline to be whatever the date was, I think the 29th, and possession to take place on November 1st. So we've now agreed to that. Well, then my sister calls me and says, hey, I just realized, now this is probably a week after we had already signed the contract, but she calls me and says, hey, I just realized November 1st is Sunday, and I don't really want to move in on Sunday. I want to move in on Saturday because a couple of my boys are going hunting and blah, blah, blah. Well, I said, okay, but I can go back and ask them if we can have possession on Saturday. But we already signed the contract saying that they could have till November 1st. So here's the point. This is a legally binding contract. So once you have signed it, it's not like we can just go back and say to somebody, hey, never mind. We want to move in on Saturday. So you need to be out so that we can move in on Saturday. It takes two people signing the contract to get into it. Therefore, how many people have to sign to get out of it or to modify it?
Two.
Both parties.
Yeah, two, right? So that's what's going to take place. Oh, also just, I noticed most of you guys have started doing this, but make sure you put in the chat box your name, office, and license number. So for the next few classes, I need your license number in there at least once. I don't need it every class, but I need you at least one time for the 12-hour new agent for me to give you credit, CE credit. I need your license number in there. So make sure you do that at least once. Okay. So yeah, it takes two people to modify or change that. So just keep that in mind that once we sign all of this, that unless both parties will agree to it, we're not changing it. It is what it is. All right. Now that I've spent 10 minutes on this is a legally binding contract, we'll go to the next. All right. So this agreement is entered into and effective on blank day of whatever month and year by Century 21 Everest, and then you're going to put in the seller. So here's the first question for you. Where do we get the name? Well, let me start on the date. The effective date of this, you're going to put in the date you want the contract to start. So I will get calls from agents from time to time saying, hey, I'm going to be going out and listing the property, but we don't want it to hit the MLS until we get photos. Well, it used to be that you could list a property and you had 5 days to put it on the MLS, so it gave you time to get it. How long do we have now from when we get this signed to when it has to be on the MLS? Any ideas?
Well, the MLS just told me 5 days, but I think it's 24 hours now, as long as if you post it on any kind of social media.
Correct. That's exactly right. So it used to be 5 days, but now it's 1. So we have to get it put in place. So a lot of times agents are like, well, I want to get photos done. So instead, what you would do is just have them sign this, but you're going to put the effective date to be a few days down the road. So that's the other option, is you sign a listing exclusion form is the other option that you can do. But so typically for me, I just usually will sign this and put it effective on whatever date that I want it to hit the market. The thing is with that though, is just make sure to save yourself some extra paperwork. Make sure that when you do that, that whatever you put on the MLS data input sheet matches the effective date here as well. All right. Next then, the next line on there is the seller. So some of this stuff might feel a little bit remedial as I'm asking these questions, but there's a point to it. So where do we get the name of the seller?
Tax
County
ID.
records.
On records, yep.
Okay, I heard county records. What was the other one?
Said tax ID. You click on
Okay,
the
yeah, good.
bullet. Yeah.
Perfect. How accurate are the county records and the tax ID off the MLS?
I would say pretty accurate. I mean, it shows the last year's taxes, so I would assume they're pretty accurate, but I have no idea.
Good. So yeah, I would agree with that. And I would not say 100%. I would say pretty accurate, fairly accurate, something like that. Here's the point. And here's the story that I always like to use with this, because it's a real world example that happened. I had an agent that was new, had gone out and gotten his very first listing. As he got his very first listing, he had pulled up the tax records to look and see who was on file with the county for that. And when he put in then the name that was on the county records onto this listing agreement, he went and got it signed by the guy who was on title, came back to the office. The market was somewhat similar to how it is today, meaning properties were selling very quickly. And what happened then is it went on the MLS. He got an offer really quick. Well, one of the things that I would recommend that you guys do now is, so we're talking about the name of the seller here. As soon as you get this signed, you should go to the title company and order a preliminary title report. As soon as you get the listing agreement signed, go order that preliminary title report so that you can find out really for sure who is on title. The county records are fairly accurate. I think it's the word we used, and I would agree, but they're not all totally accurate. So this agent luckily had jumped on that quickly, ordered the preliminary title report, and in the process of getting an offer, so they were in the process of negotiating the offer, they then also received the preliminary title report. When they got the preliminary title report, what they did was the first thing you want to check when you get that preliminary title report is who is on title. So the agent checked that and noticed there was another name on the preliminary title report that was not on the county records. Came to me and said, what do I do? So question for you guys is, what do you do? If you got it signed and then you find out somebody else is on the records, what do you do?
Go ask the sellers who that person is or where I can contact them and make sure you get their signatures as well. Otherwise it's not going anywhere.
Perfect. That's exactly right, Darren. So we got to go get that. So the agent comes to me and says, what do I do? And I said, well, go find out who this is. So he calls up the client, says, who is that? The client says, oh, it's my mom. And he says, great. Well, and I need your mom to sign the listing agreement and to be signing this offer. Now, luckily, we were in the process of negotiating and the ball was in the court of our agent. And so what our agent did is went back and did a counter offer that said it is subject to the mom and whatever her name was agreeing to the terms of the contract. Well, luckily we had done that because the mom was on a cruise somewhere, and the seller, the guy, said she wasn't going to be back for a week. So we did that, and then a week goes by and the mom's still not back. Supposedly she decided to go on another week-long cruise. So we have another week go by, and finally, and I don't remember exactly, but somehow we finally tracked down the mom because we were telling the seller, we got to get her signature on this in order for this to happen. Well, when the agent got a hold of the mom, guess what the mom said? I wouldn't be telling the story if she said yes, right? So the mom says, absolutely not. I'm not signing that. In fact, I am the one who bought the home. And the reason I am on title is because apparently he had tried this once before to sell the property and she wasn't on title. And I don't know how she got it unwound, but she did. Well, now she's saying, so absolutely not. And what are you doing even marketing the property without my permission? So we had to kind of explain what happened, and she understood, thankfully, what had happened. But here's the point. Check the county records, see what's there, and put that on. But as soon as you get that preliminary title report, you have got to check to make sure you have all the signatures, because if not, you don't really have a valid contract. And that one could have turned really ugly, but luckily we had made it subject to the mom signing. And when she wouldn't, obviously the buyers were upset, but there wasn't a whole lot they could do about it because it was subject to her signing. All right, so that's on the seller line. Now, as we go through this, here's kind of the idea of what I'm going to do with you guys is I'm not going to spend time on each of the sections per se. If you've got questions, there's some that we will, but for the most part, the idea of today is what's the paperwork you need to get filled out at a minimum with a seller, and how do you fill it out? All right. So next, the terms of the listing. So the seller hereby grants the company including, and then obviously it's going to be your name there. So I won't ask you whose name goes there. It's yours. As the authorized agent, and that it's going to end at 5 p.m. on blank day of month of year. So what should we put in there? How far out should we sign this? How many months should the listing agreement be for?
I used to do 6 months, but now, I mean, in this market currently, I mean, to get a home under contract, I'd put 60 to 90 days just because it makes them feel more confident in my abilities. And I can say, hey, I don't even need 6 months. I've got this. But it just depends on the house, the price point, and all that other stuff. So anyway, I could be doing it wrong.
Okay, no, it's great. So for me, and there's not necessarily a right answer, but let me tell you kind of what my thinking is. Typically, I will just default to a 6-month agreement. And part of that is I'm willing to do it for less than 6 months, similar to what you're saying, Darren. For me though, I usually default it to a minimum of 4. I put a minimum of 4 months on there. And my thinking on that is that I want to at least have a chance to get a return on my money. Now, as Darren's saying, I mean, with how the market is right now, it shouldn't take longer than that. The other thing that I have found for me of why a lot of times I will do 4 or 5 months versus a 6 is I've kind of found that if I can't get the job done in about 4 months, it's probably not going to happen. And I have found that typically if the job's not done by then, the seller's pretty frustrated and typically wanting out, thinking it's my fault anyway that it didn't happen. Thankfully, I haven't had to deal with that too much. But for me, I usually say when I'm training it, I train it as a default of 6 months. So put 6 months on there. But again, as Darren said, like to some extent in the current market, if somebody was willing to price it right, I probably would do a 2 or a 3. But honestly, for me, I don't know if I've ever done less than 4. I always just do minimum of 4. Now that's just me, but so I would say minimum of 4, but typically default to 6 months just to give yourself time to get that done. All right, next blank line in there is the described as, which is obviously just going to be the address of the property is what you're going to put in there as with the described as. All right, so typically I just mentioned we're not going to hit every section necessarily, but I am, part of what I like to do with this class is talk about how to fill it out and then how I explain it to the seller. So when I'm going through this contract, typically with a seller, I will give them 3 options. Either they can just read through the whole thing, so I can just give it to them, they can read the whole thing, or I can go through and explain what it says to them, or they can just sign it. Now, which of those 3 do you think people usually choose?
It depends on how detail oriented they are.
Okay, good question. Or good point.
Some will trust you and just sign it, and some might want to read the finer print.
Yeah, typically your analyticals, the engineers, the attorneys want to read the whole thing. Great. But so how often do you think that happens though?
I would say for me, about 20 to 40% of the time. It just depends if it's a SOI. It definitely doesn't happen very often because they trust what I'm saying. But if it's somebody that I just met or did a cold call and we're going on a listing presentation, 9 times out of 10 they want to read the whole thing or have me go through it line by line.
Okay. So yeah. So for me, what I have found is that most of the time, what will end up happening is that people will just say, just explain it to me. Generally is what happens. Just tell me what I'm signing. So that's how I'm going to approach it with you guys. If somebody wants to read it, again, back to where I said this is a legally binding contract. If they want to read it, let them read it. Generally, the majority of the time, and I would say for me, probably it's 70 or 80% of the time, they just want me to explain it to them. I can actually only think of in 25 years, a handful of times that somebody has said, I want to read it. Like it's pretty rare that I've come across that. And I would also then the flip side of that say, there are only a few times where people have just said, just tell me just show me where to sign. And I love when that one happens, but so I'm going to do it with you guys as if I was explaining it to the person. Okay. So section 2 is talking about the brokerage fee. So we're not going to read the whole thing, but I would recommend you guys should at least read through this whole thing once. You should sit down with a yellow highlighter or a pen, and you should read this entire thing and make some notes if you have questions or whatever, but you should at least have read this one time. Like honestly, every one of you should at least one time read through this whole thing so that you can at least say you have read it. Okay. So you should definitely do that. But for the sake of what we're going to do today, I'm just going to explain to you guys how I would be explaining it. So for me, when on this brokerage fee, the way that I usually will handle this is I usually will have done a seller net sheet. Now you're going to get differing opinions from people on if you should do a seller net sheet or not. You're going to have some people that say, don't ever do a seller net sheet. In fact, I had a guy that was in charge of compliance at a different company that's the way he taught it. Do not ever do a seller net sheet. And his reasoning for that was too many agents do it wrong, and therefore they create a problem, is what his thinking was. For me, I actually feel like for the most part, you almost have to do a net sheet for most sellers. They have to at least have an idea of what that's going to look like. My very first listing I ever did was a neighbor of mine that lived behind me in Kitty Corner, and I had listed their property and I had done the seller net sheet. And when we got to closing, I had done it wrong. I'll tell you guys, my very first listing, I had done it wrong. I was off by, I want to say it was about $1,000. So luckily it wasn't a huge amount. And luckily, the other thing that I didn't realize is that when they pay off the home, that usually your mortgage payment is always done in arrears. So you're paying the interest for last month. You're not paying it ahead of schedule. And so typically the way I will explain it to a seller is when you bought the house, you went without making a payment for an extra month, you went a month without. So for example, my sister just closed end of October, but her first payment is going to be in December. So you skip that month because you're paying in arrears. Well, when it comes time to sell the house, what happens is that catches up with you. That extra month you didn't make a payment when you bought the house, you get to make an extra payment essentially at the end of the transaction when you close. So I didn't calculate that. So I was off by about $1,000. I mean, it was probably 700 and something. But luckily they had money in their escrow account that we hadn't planned on. And usually on that escrow account, they will then pay you that money back later. They'll send you a check. But luckily on this particular one, they happened to do it just as they deducted it from their principal balance. So it actually worked out, but I learned a big lesson on that one of making sure that I did it right. I've never messed up on a net sheet since then. I've always overdone it so that when they get to closing, they're getting more money that I told them. Now, so for me on this brokerage fee, typically I've already done the net sheet that I've already shown to them and explained the net sheet to them. Now, here's what I recommend for you guys today. Back then, I would always go through and calculate it. What I would recommend though today instead that you do is go to the title company. And since we now have one here in Utah, I will say go to North Star and ask them to do an estimated seller's net sheet. And what they will do is they'll get the information from you and they can calculate it so that you can give that then to the seller. But as part of why I do that is so that I will go through that net sheet with them first to show them these are all the fees that are going to be involved. And typically all they really care about is how much money am I walking away with? Because that's a lot of times how they're making the decision on the next house is based upon how much money am I walking away with. I get the title company to put that together, and then I'm going to go show that to the seller of here's how much I'm thinking you should get from the sale of your house. Now, on that, you got to be a little careful again, because if you put in a purchase price on there, which you kind of have to do, they now become committed to that price. But I like to do that, and here's why. If I can get them to agree to that net sheet first, then when we go over here to commission, and I can just say I kind of will, I want to say breeze through it. I don't know if that's the right word, but in essence, I will just say to them, hey, on this brokerage fee, it just says that you're going to pay me the commission that we talked about, that we had over on the seller net sheet. And ultimately you can they've already agreed to the amount they're going to walk away with. And very rarely are they look to see exactly what that commission looks like. And as long as they're seeing what the number makes sense for them, they usually don't have as big of an issue. So you'll notice on this one, if you look at the brokerage fee, that you will notice here, right here, that it says 7%. Now, my very first listing I ever got, as a new agent, I just assumed 6% was what it was. Well, so here's what happened then is I went out on this first listing appointment. I got out there. I had not read through this document, which as a result of this listing is when I then decided I should at least read it once. I got out there and was filling it out, and the seller said to me, so what's the commission going to be? And I grabbed this and saw brokerage fee and looked, and just like what you're seeing here, I saw it said 7%. And I was like, so I guess looks like the listing, it's going to be 7%. And he goes, okay. So he signed the agreement. I go back to the office. I turn it into the office, and my manager says, so you got the listing? And I said, yeah. And he says, let me see it. And he takes the paperwork and looks through it and goes, good job. That's awesome. And I was like, oh, thanks. Well, our next sales meeting that we had, which was always on Tuesdays, I get to the sales meeting, and at the sales meeting, he says, hey, you guys all have met Russ, and he's a new agent here, blah, blah, blah. And he goes, he got his first listing, and everyone clapped. Woo, good job. Congratulations. And he goes, oh, hold on though. His first listing, he listed it at 7%. And all the agents that were in this sales meeting were like, whoa, and I'm sitting there going like, what's the big deal? Like I didn't understand. Now, what I found out afterwards is the company's documents said 7%, but what most agents were doing was crossing it out and putting 6% and having their clients initial it. But my manager didn't tell me that, so I didn't know. I just assumed it was 7%. And I went out on the listing and presented it and got a 7% listing and turned it in just because I didn't know any better. So here's the point. Don't just assume that people will never do that, because I have done a lot of 8% listings as well, not just 7. And I'll say more about that later. But don't assume that 6%, or even what I'm seeing today is tons of people doing, is a 5. In fact, I had an agent come to me this week that stuck his head in the door into my office and said something about a 5% listing. And I said, well, I hope you're offering 3% to whoever brings in the buyer. And he's like, no, I'm offering 2.5. Well, this particular agent does a lot of buyer transactions. And I said, how do you feel when you're on the buyer side and somebody's only offering 2 or 2.5? And he's like, well, I don't like it. And I said, well, then why would you do it? And basically he said, well, it's what I had to do to get the listing. But here's the thing. I know I'm on my soapbox a little bit here, but I get frustrated because agents decide what, if I'm working a buyer, some other agents decided how they're taking a pay cut for me. And I just don't feel like that's fair. So if you don't have the ability to sell yourself, don't punish me because you're not a good salesperson, I guess is how I look at it. So I just have a belief of you need to offer 3% on the MLS. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox now. But part of what I would recommend doing is, stop and think about it. When you're the agent and you show a house and you see that somebody's offering 3.5%, do you get a little bit excited and hoping your client wants to buy that house? Or would you? I haven't let you guys participate, so.
Absolutely. I was putting my hands up like this, just assuming you'd see it. Yes,
good.
that would be exciting to see the 3.5.
I can't see the screen. Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, that's just it. Like, so part of it is what I will tell sellers, and I know I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this, but I want to help you guys take a higher commission. Part of what I do is I will tell a seller, look, us getting your home sold is not just a matter of getting buyers interested. We also have to get the agents interested. And in order for us to get the agents interested, the first place most agents will look is to see, when they show this property, how much commission are they going to get paid? And whether we like it or not, that is a reality. Meaning, if you were to talk to the division, they would say, and you think about our fiduciary duties, we're not supposed to make a decision based upon that. And I will totally agree with that. But human nature tells me, and I've been in this business long enough to know that there's a lot of agents that will look at it, and yeah, they'll still show the house, but they're going to try to show every other house first. So if you just can explain to the seller, we got to get the agents excited about showing your house, And the best way that we're going to be able to do that is by enticing them to want to show the house by showing a higher commission. So now remember I said to you, I've taken 8% listings. When I did 8% listings, I always offered 4 to whoever brought in the buyer. So I would keep 4 and they would get 4. And I promise you, they get excited when they see it. In fact, I would get calls from people and be like, is this right? You're really offering 4% to whoever brings in the buyer? And I'd say, yep, that is right. See, the other thing that I have found that I will use on helping a seller to see it's worth paying a little bit more commission is here's what I've found. Now put yourself in the position of you're the buyer's agent. Your client's interested in my listing and I'm offering you 4% to bring in the buyer. When your client says to you, hey, do you think we could offer a little bit lower on this house? Like I have just found the agent's typically going to want to try to negotiate less, meaning they're going to probably negotiate more with their client than they are with me because they want the deal to happen. Now, here's where it is even better. See, a lot of times what will happen, and I'm just, this piece I'm telling you guys now, I'm telling you from my own perspective of real life, this has happened. So I'm going to give you 2 different scenarios. The first one was the client, I had a property under contract and they were only offering 2.5%. When it was time to negotiate repairs as part of our due diligence, I almost hoped that we wouldn't, like I was kind of like, let's go in and ask for a ton of things, a ton of repairs. Let's ask for all these repairs to get done. Hoping that maybe the deal would fall through because we could then go find something else that would offer maybe a 3%. But now let's reverse it. I've also been on the side where I offered 4%. Do you think that buyer's agent wants to come in and go, hey, we'll just cancel this and we'll go find a different house?
Nope.
Yeah, less likely. The agent wants to keep the deal together. The buyer's agent, if they know they're getting a 3.5 or a 4% commission, I promise you, they are going to negotiate with their client on the repairs of like, hey, I don't know if we should ask for that much. Or even if they do, I promise they're going to do everything they can to try to keep this deal together because they know if this deal falls through, they're, especially in our current market, think about that. They know they're probably going to go out and get a 2.5% versus a 3.5.
Questions.
Like,
My thing was cutting out. I've got 2 questions. Number 1, when we go get the net sheet created, are we wanting to do more research to find out if there's like solar panels or any kind of liens on the property beforehand, or do we just want to keep it as basic as we can and then add on later once we find that information out?
Yeah, good question. So if I can find the information out beforehand, I would want to. So yeah, I think you should try to ask some of those questions, but I'm also not opposed to showing up with a estimated seller's proceeds and saying, you know, finding out and just going, okay, well, then we got to subtract that out. So yeah, ideally though, if you can get it, I would get it.
Awesome. And then question number 2, my computer was freaking out for a second there, so I just popped back in. Are we 3.5% on the BAC? Is that a firm, or is that just kind of comes down to our decision with that?
Yeah, it's just our decision. It's just what I'm recommending to you. Yeah, okay. I mean, so you got to bring up a good point. Here's the one that really ticks me off that I've seen is that because right now it is more of a seller's market than a buyer's, meaning that there are more buyers than there are sellers. I've watched agents go list a property at 6% and only offer 2 to whoever brings in the buyer. Like I've seen that happen too, which again bugs me because I'm like, okay, well, when things turn around and it's the other way, are you going to offer 4 and keep 2 yourself? No, you're not. So like, anyway, this kind of stuff just kind of frustrates me. So yeah, it's more of just for me of just feeling like, hey, you offer, in my opinion, we're hurting ourselves right now because the market is so good for a seller to be able to say, well, we don't have to offer that much commission. People will still go buy it. The story I told you on my sisters, they were offering 1% BAC. And I just told my sister, like, if it was 2.5, like I would eat the 0.5%, but I'm not doing it for 1. Like, sorry, you're going to have to pay the difference if we can't negotiate it. I was able to negotiate it to where I still got the full 3. So my point is, when you're on the buy side, don't just settle for a 2 and a 2.5. Fight to try to get the whole thing. But when you're on the listing side, look out for our other agents, and hopefully they'll do the same for you. But unfortunately, I know we're headed down a slippery slope. But
So how
go
do we
ahead.
fight against discount brokerages then, like Homey, with regards to like when we do a listing presentation, they're like, dude, I see 7%, but Homey's only going to charge me 2,000 plus, 2.5% for the BAC. What would you say we do there?
Yeah, that's probably where you were gone while I was saying it. But essentially, I would say,
Go get surgery from a discount doctor.
yeah. My son's sitting in class with me, and he brought me this nice drink. What a good son, huh? But
Nice work.
But he just said, tell them to go ask them if they're getting surgery if they want it from a discount surgeon. So, but here's the thing is at the end of the day, so just to quickly, because I think you probably just missed it before, Darren, is I just say, look, we got to entice the agents to want to bring a buyer to you. And if you offer 2.5%, they're not going to. And here's what I will tell you is I have seen, well, actually, let me sum it up this way. There's an agent that I trained at a different company that he is now here with us at Everest as well. He works out of the Centerville office. His name is Trent Hyde. Trent came through this and heard me talk about this before. And then he went out and he would list, this was during 2009, 2010, when the market was bad. He would go out and list properties at 8%, like I was talking about. But rather than doing 4 and 4, which I told him he should have done, he was offering 5 to whoever brought in the buyer. Now, he would keep 3 and offer 5 to whoever brought in the buyer. Here's the interesting thing. And so this is where I would say, and I 100% believe this is true. If you were to, and you can go look this up if you want to, go on the MLS, go find back in 2009, 10, I don't know how long he did it, but Trent Hyde, find his listings and you run a CMA on those properties from when he sold them and look at how they compared to the other properties that were in the same price range and neighborhood. His were selling at top dollar compared to what other people's properties were listing for and selling. And the reason being what I said to you, when an agent sees they're going to get 4 or 5%, they're going to try to negotiate with their seller more than they're going to, their buyer, more than they're going to try to negotiate with you on the deal. And they're going to try to keep the deal together to where Trent would go in and show his sellers, look, my homes sell for more money. So yes, you're going to pay me a little bit more, but does it matter what you're paying me if you make more? If you make more money at the end of the day, do you really care what you paid me? And they're going to say what? No.
Nope.
So here's what I know. Because here's the thing, over and over and over again, I personally, like I said, this 1% that the agent was offering on my sister's condo, I went in, we were in a multiple offer situation, guys. I got the offer accepted and I got a full 3% commission. So don't just assume you can't do it, is I guess what I'm saying. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox, but I feel like we got to try to protect it, because otherwise, before you know it, we're all making 2% like they do in California or in New York. And that's where we're headed to, unfortunately. All right. So if you can create value, they'll pay a higher. In fact, actually one other agent that I trained, I just heard recently, I didn't hear it from her. She's here with our company, but I heard the other day from one of the other managers that she still has never taken a listing for less than 7%, which I think is awesome. So just know it's possible to do it. Okay. All right. Next thing on there is the 495. And I know we're spending a lot of time. I'm spending way too much time on this. Like we're 45 minutes in and we're on section 2 of this huge packet. We'll pick up the pace, but I think this one's important, this section. So the next piece on there, you'll notice it says plus a 495. I just want to make sure you guys understand, as part of being with the company, you have agreed to charge a minimum of a 295 to your client. Anything above that will go to you on your split. And I want to make sure you hear it that way, that it's on your split. So in this case, there would be an additional $200 that is coming to me on my split, whatever my split is. Now, the reason agents will do that is if they're using a transaction coordinator, they might want to charge a 595 to help offset the fee to using a transaction coordinator. but the minimum you need to be doing is the 295. So on dot loop, you can get these contracts that are at a 6% plus 295 or a 6% plus 395 plus 495 plus 595 plus 695. You can charge up to 995. Anything above that, you need to get approval from. We had one agent in the company that was going out and doing, and I saw this contract, so I know it's not just hearsay. She charged a 7% plus $4,700 as the administration fee. So after that was when we as a company said, okay, you better be able to justify if you're going above 995. And she had agreed apparently to do some additional things, but anyway, slippery slope. So don't go above that. All right. Any other questions on the brokerage fee section? All right, I'm going to pick up the pace then a bit here. All right, so protection period. If within blank months, what should we put there?
6 for the minimum.
Okay. Any
Oh,
other?
shoot, I always put
Is
3.
that what
Oh,
you're
no,
telling
sorry.
us?
No, on section 3, I'm asking for what you think. That's going to be different than what we talked about in section 1.
I typically put 3, but I mean, ultimately,
Good. There's no right answer. I would say minimum put 1. At a minimum, put 1 month, but I like the idea of 2 or 3. If you wanted to put 6, that's fine as well. Here's how I explain it to the seller. This section is basically just keeping honest people honest. It's to protect us that if we get down to the end of this contract, that it protects the seller if a buyer walks through their house of saying to the seller, hey, if you come back tomorrow, my contract's expired and you wouldn't have to pay, I could give you a better price. So I just always explain it to the seller is this is to keep honest people honest. It's to keep you, if we get down to the end, anybody that I showed the property to, you would still owe me a commission if they bought it within a couple of months or whatever you put in there. Okay.
I had that almost backfire on an agent because he said we don't work with people that don't do that, so they put 0. And my clients almost bought the house 3 months later, and he would have got cut out because he didn't have the.
Interesting. Did you guys hear that? Could you hear him?
I couldn't hear him.
Okay, say it again louder.
So last year or 2 years ago, 18 months ago, I had a client and we were looking at $800,000 houses. We went under contract on one, and then we couldn't end up getting our house sold in time. We had a very short window, so we canceled the contract. But the seller of the house said, well, let's try and put something back together in the springtime when you guys are ready to come on the market. So my listing agreement didn't expire with my clients, but that house, their listing agreement expired with the seller's agent. So when we listed our house, the seller contacted us again and said, hey, I don't have my agent. Let's do something without them. Somehow the agent ended up getting word that they were trying to negotiate without him. And he's like, did you do that? I said, well, they called us and said that they don't have an agent. Do you have a protection period? Because we were under contract for a month with them previously. And he said, no, I don't believe in working with clients that need a protection period. So we always put 0. I said, well, it would have been good to have it now. And we ended up not even buying that house. We bought a different house and it didn't end up costing him anything, but it was just funny. And like, he's an agent that does big time deals in Sugar House, and he just believes that I don't want to work with people that don't use that would go behind his back and sell it without, but he almost missed out on $40,000 worth of commission.
Yeah. Here's the thing, I guess, that I would say on just to add to that, and this actually goes to a scenario with an agent that I actually had on my team that I would have thought I could trust is when it comes down to it and it's time all of a sudden for money to change hands, it's amazing how many times all of a sudden these people who you would have thought would be totally trustworthy and would agree, all of a sudden are like, well, I don't remember you saying that. I don't remember agreeing to that. And so for me, again, that's why I always say it as I call this protection period, the keeping honest people honest is all it is. It's just the section to protect us. So I would recommend you put in a few months there just because of exactly what Douglas just said, which is it's possible that they come back down to it on that in that scenario and go, well, we'll still sell it to you and we now don't have to pay a commission. So, all right, next, seller's warranties and disclosures. When I get to this section, I just am telling the seller what this is saying is that you are warranting that you have the right to be selling it. That story I told you at the start of class, ultimately this is saying you are the only person on title. You're the only one that needs to agree to it. And you're agreeing you have the right to be doing that. And that you're going to disclose everything you know about the property. So when I get to this section is usually when I will introduce seller disclosures to them as well. So let me scroll up here. This is when I will introduce the seller disclosures to the client as well, of telling them that they need to fill out the seller disclosures and disclose everything they know. Now, when we get to seller disclosures, I'll tell you what I say about that. But for now, we're going to hold on that. Now, I'm going to pick up the pace a little, but stop me or ask questions if you have them as we go, please. Section 5 is agency relationship. When I get to this point is where I will explain to the seller, I'm on your side. We are not adversaries in this. We are working together. And sometimes a client, I will notice, feels like they're negotiating against me when we get an offer in, that like I'm trying to get them to do something they don't want to do, but I'm not. I am looking out for your best interest and I'm on your side. So you don't have to feel like you have to hold things back from me. Anything I know, I'm going to tell you. Anything you know or you thought you have, whatever, you should be telling me. We're on the same side. We're working together in this, okay? And then I also will explain to them the duties of a limited agent, where I'm just asking them, here's how I do it. I just say to them, if somebody calls me off the sign and wants me to show your house, do you want me to show it to them? And they usually will go, well, yeah, well, why wouldn't I? And I just say, well, because in that scenario, I would have to be a limited agent. But I've also found that there's really no difference between me being a limited agent and another agent showing up. And what I mean by that is if another agent brings me an offer, I don't know the most their buyer's willing to pay. In a limited agent scenario, I might know, I just can't tell you. But me not being able to tell you is really no different than not knowing from another agent. And I've just found that if I'm working both sides, the transaction goes smoother because I don't have to deal with the other agent's ego. And a lot of times, I hate to say it, but that's the truth, guys. Agents' egos get in the way of transactions way too often. So, all right. Again, stop me if you have questions. Otherwise, I'm going to keep plowing. So I'm going to have them initial here. Let's go then to page 2. So again, if I forget to scroll up, you guys that are just looking online, let me know. All right. Next then is the expiration. On this one is saying the expiration date will automatically extend to the closing of the property if it's under contract. So essentially, if you did this as a 4-month, but we sold it in month 3 and it wasn't going to close till after the expiration date, this is saying that it automatically extends to whatever that closing date is. So that way you don't have to do an addendum extending this, okay? Section 7 is professional advice. Here's how I handle this. With the seller, I always just end with the buyer, but when I get to the professional advice section, I just tell them, don't trust anything I tell you. And I usually, that's how I explain it, which kind of catches them a little bit off guard of like, wait a minute, you just told me you're on my side and you're working for me. Now you're saying, don't trust anything I tell you. Well, what I tell them is basically it's because I'm trained in the marketing of real estate. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a CPA. I'm not a property inspector. And they expect you to have those answers. You know, tell me, how is this going to affect me on my taxes if I sell it at this price or whatever? I don't know. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a CPA. You need to talk to them. So ultimately, I just tell them in the professional advice section, this just is letting you know I'm trained in the marketing of real estate. Don't rely on anything else that I tell you outside of that. Talk to a professional. Section 8 is dispute resolution. Just says that in the event that there is a dispute, we will go to mediation before going to court. Section 9 says in the event we end up in court, the prevailing party is entitled to reasonable attorney's fees. And I just want you guys to know, like, that actually really happens. I have a friend who had done a title company that then the title company he was with before ended up suing him for doing that. He ended up losing in this lawsuit and kind of was like, well, all right, it's going to cost me, I think it was like $50,000 or something. And I mean, not that he was excited about that, but it was like, okay. Then they turned around and sued him for their attorney's fees, which all of a sudden amplified what he was going to owe huge. So just know that's what this section is saying. Is in the event we end up in court, the prevailing party is entitled to getting their attorney's fees paid as well. Okay? What? Yeah, it sucks. All right, section 10, advertising and seller authorization. With the seller, I'm telling them, what this is saying is that you have authorized me to advertise the property, and they've also authorized A through M here, which we're not going to hit on, but a couple of these. So 10A is that they're giving us permission to disclose to the MLS after closing the purchase price. We need that because we're a non-disclosure state. And so because we're a non-disclosure state, we have to get permission to disclose that final purchase price. And we're also getting from them where they got the square footage from. There's two places that the seller has to disclose where they got the square footage from. One is to us right here in the listing agreement. The other is to the buyer in the seller disclosures. All right. Then the rest of these is that we can have a key, we can get financial information, hold open houses, order a preliminary title report, get a home warranty. We can put the earnest money into an interest-bearing trust account, which we don't do. And that the seller's instructing us not to present other offers as well. All right. Section 11. I know I'm going kind of fast, so stop me if you have questions on this. Section 11 is personal property. And on this one, here's how I handle this. I'm going to take some time on this one though, too. Section 11 on personal property. When we get to that, I always tell them, if you have things you don't want to include in the sale, get rid of it now. Get it out of the property today. And here's why. I had a transaction where I had the buyer. We had walked through the house, and in walking through the house, my buyer said, oh, look at that shelf that they made. That is such a cool shelf. And I love that. Do you think that they will include that with it? And I just said, well, we can ask for it. So we wrote the offer. I put in there that it would include the shelf, and the seller came back and said, no, we want to exclude that. Well, the buyer liked the house anyway, but just wanted the shelf. Well, the buyer said to me, I won't buy the house if they don't include the shelf. I had to go back to the seller and say, the only way this deal is happening is if the seller will include the shelf. Like, we almost lost the deal over the shelf, which is stupid. Like, that shouldn't be a thing. So here's what I learned from that though, is if my seller says I'm not including the shelf, I tell him, great, get rid of it today then. Get it out of the house and change it. The other one that I had, which again was stupid, I don't understand it, but the seller had put on the MLS, the ceiling fan is not included. Well, of course, the buyer says, well, I want the ceiling fan. And I'm like, you can get a different one. And even the husband said, you can get a different one. The wife's like, no, I like the looks of that one. I want it to stay. If they want something not included, tell them to get it out of the house now, because then you don't have to worry about it. The other thing I tell them on the personal property here is if you have any guns or illegal drugs, stuff like that, you should get rid of it out of the house today too, because we're not responsible if somebody decides to steal your illegal drugs that you have. I'm joking on that, obviously, but I actually did list a house that had a separate compartment, hidden space in the basement where they did have a pot growing setup. That was kind of interesting. It was a foreclosure, but it was one of those things that I had gone through, looked at the house, taken pictures and everything. And then a neighbor called me and said, did you find their secret place? And I was like, what are you talking about? And went back and I had to move. If I remember, it was like a bookcase or something, moved it out of the way and it opened up a whole new section of the house that I didn't even know existed. All right. Next, section 12 is the attachment. So this would be if you're using an addendum. Now, it's pretty rare that you're going to do it, but let me give you an example of when you might. Is a time when you may use an attachment would be, let's say I was listing it for sale by owner that said, I've got these 3 people that said they're interested in the house. and I'll list the home with you, but I don't want to pay a commission if one of them buys it. Then I would check the box. There are attachments. Get an addendum to the listing agreement and list on there, these people are excluded from this contract for 30 days. Put a time frame on it if you're going to do that. Okay. So pretty rare that you're going to do it, but occasionally you may do an addendum and that you'd either check R or R not. And like I say, most of the time you're going to check R not. Section 13 is equal housing opportunity. Just says that we are going to follow all the state and federal fair housing laws. 14, we're agreeing that we could do electronic transmissions and counterparts. So we're agreeing we could use a dot loop or a DocuSign, or back in the old days, faxes we could do. All right. Which to some extent, like the Division of Real Estate, if you're sending them something, a lot of times still wants a fax, believe it or not. But all right. Next, due on sale clause. So now, since I haven't had you guys involved, let me ask you a question so I can make sure you're still alive and paying attention. What is the purpose of a due on sale clause, and why would we have it in our listing agreement to talk to a seller about it? When would they need to worry?
It's saying if you sell the property that the full amount is due to the bank. So
Sorry, say that again.
underwater
Sorry, say that again.
It's saying that if they sell the property that the loan is due, so if they're underwater on the home, they're gonna sell the house and have to pay money.
Okay, so in what scenarios would they be worried about that?
If they owe more than the house is worth.
Okay, so if they owe more than the house is worth, it's ultimately they're just going to have to pay it off. So that's good. Yep. What else?
Seller financing. A lot of loans are like, you can't, do seller financing if you go to sell, and some people will say, well, I've got the equity, so I want to do seller financing.
Perfect. That's really the biggest time you're going to have to worry about it, is if you are doing a seller finance. If the seller is going to seller finance it, you need to make sure they understand this due on sale clause, that if the bank, if they have a mortgage on the property and the mortgage company finds out about it, that they're doing this seller finance, they could call the note due and payable at that time. So outside of that, if they're just doing a traditional sale, really this due on sale clause doesn't really matter. So really, if you had not asked them already, you would ask when you get to section 15, are you willing to finance this on behalf of a buyer? And if they say no, then really they don't have to worry about this section. Okay. All right, section 16, Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act. You'll hear that referred to as FIRPTA, which is the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act. Essentially what it is this. Let me explain it to you guys what it is. First, let me say, in this section, you got to check the box that the person either is a foreign investor or they is not. Should say or not, but they either is or is not a foreign investor in real estate. You got to check the box one way or the other. Now, let me explain to you why this is important and why it matters. The way the IRS tax code is written is this. If the seller of a house is a foreign investor, the buyer is responsible to make sure that they have a tax ID. Basically, it's the government the IRS wants to make sure if there is a gain in this property and they owe taxes from selling it, capital gains, they want to make sure they're going to get paid. And it is the buyer's responsibility to make sure that the seller has that tax ID number if it's a foreign investor. If they don't, if the buyer doesn't ensure that, guess who owes the taxes? The buyer. And this has actually happened up in Park City, where a person from some other country had bought a property up there, turned around and sold it for a huge gain. The buyer bought it. They didn't ensure that the seller had a tax ID number so that the IRS could try to collect their portion of it. And the IRS came to the buyer and said, you owe us like $35,000 or something. Well, the buyer then, of course, tried to get that to the title company and saying, you guys got to pay this, which I think they ultimately did. But in order to avoid it, the buyer is just responsible to make sure that the seller gives to the title company a tax ID number. So that's what you need to know about it. But for you guys filling it out, you just need to find out from the seller, are you a foreign investor or are they not? Do they have a social security number or a tax ID number? And if they do, as long as it goes to the title company, the buyer's fine. So we need to have them check is or is not. If they check that they is a foreign investor, then you need to get a forwarding address on that bottom line. If they are not, you don't need it, okay? All right, section 17. This is the entire agreement. There's not anything that's not agreed to. Anything you agree to needs to be in writing or it's not gonna come into play, is basically what that's saying. Then they're gonna sign, you are authorized to sign on behalf of the brokerage. And before we flip the page, which I guess I gotta scroll up here, you'll notice in red here, it says, do you have a real estate need, a property to sell or purchase outside of the market area or the state of Utah? Make sure you're asking that question, because if you can get them as a referral, an outgoing referral, you can make a little bit of extra money by referring somebody. So that's just your reminder on that. All right, next form, the MLS data input sheet. So this is the residential listing input sheet. Here's what I'm going to tell you on this. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time going through it. I am going to point out a few things. You will notice right here next to list price, there's this little dot. Anything on this form that has a dot next to it, so just below you'll see short sale, there's a dot. But over here on least considered, there's no dot. If there's a dot, that is a required field. You have to put something in there. If there's no dot, it's okay if you don't answer. So for example, we get down here to this quadrant, there's no dot. So I could leave that blank. The project or subdivision, I don't need to fill it out. But the city I do, the county I do, the state, the zip code, anything with a dot, you've got to put in. Anything without it, you can leave blank, okay? So ultimately what I'm saying, if you don't know the answer and there's not a dot, don't fill it in, it's fine. Uh-oh, echoing for some reason. All right.
Sorry.
It's okay. So if there is a dot and you don't know the answer, go find out. All right. Any questions on this as I kind of scroll through it? There's a couple areas that I'll stop and talk about, but if you see one that you have questions on, let me know. So actually solar is right here. If you have not talked to them about solar, find out, do they have solar and is it leased or owned? And if it is, make sure you use the solar, when you get an offer, use the solar addendum. All right, the other ones that I want to point out, just because a lot of times questions will come up, here's where you're going to put the listing date that I said should match with your effective date on the listing agreement. And then down here is under dual or variable, actually, no, let me go up here. Under listing type, EAL or ERS, almost always you're going to be checking the ERS, the exclusive right to sell. EAL would be an exclusive agency listing, which means only our company could sell the property. Dual or variable rate, usually there's a question on that, so let me explain it. I have seen scenarios where somebody will go in and list a property and say, I'm going to list it at 7%. But they'll tell the seller, in the event that I end up representing the buyer as well and being that limited agent, I'll only charge you 6%. Well, if you did that, you should check dual or variable rate, yes. That's what that would mean, is are there two different rates? Or is it going to vary depending on the scenario? You should check yes. If not, you would put no. Okay. So I would not recommend it. I always hesitate bringing that up because then people go, oh, that's a good idea. I should go do that. I would not recommend doing that. Like, why give up part of your commission because you're a limited agent? But a lot of times agents don't think they're worth anything, and so they'll agree to do that. I just would not recommend it. All right. Compensation offered, this is where you're going to put in if it's the 3 or 4% or 3.5%, but don't ever do less than that, my recommendation. And then the BAC based on gross or net. Let me explain that one as well, and then we'll fast forward through the rest of this one. The gross is meaning it's whatever the purchase price, the commission of the percentage is going to be based upon that. Net would mean if this buyer comes in and says, we're going to give you $300,000, but we want $5,000 in closing costs, net would mean that the commission would be based on $295 in that scenario. I recommend just always do gross. Why not? I mean, it's not that big of a deal, but some agents years ago started saying, well, we're not paying commissions on that $5,000. Okay, I mean, it's such a small amount, but whatever. So if essentially the difference between gross and net is gross is just whatever the purchase price is. Net would be if they're asking for closing costs, you would subtract that from the purchase price to calculate the commissions. All right. These check boxes, what I will tell you on this is I always just tell the seller, look through it and see if I missed anything. I will go through and try to check the boxes, but I ask them to verify it. And I always miss stuff. So don't worry that I don't even really, I do my best to get it, but I don't stress if I miss something because I have them look at it and see if and I just say, look through this and see what I missed. And then I let them see. Next, this remarks section. So under this remarks section, here's what I do. When I get to this remarks section, I always just ask them, what do you want to make sure that I put in the remarks? And they essentially end up writing the remarks for me that way by asking, what do you want to make sure we put in? What I have found is if you don't do that, you'll put in whatever you want for the remarks. It'll hit the MLS. It'll then hit all the different websites. They'll go on to some website and they'll look at the property and they're going to read the remarks. And then they call you up and say, hey, you didn't mention the cabinets that I put in the garage. So for me to avoid that phone call, I always just say, what do you want me to make sure that we put in the remarks for people to see? That way, if they forget to tell me about the cabinets in the garage, when they see it, they call me up and go, oh, I totally forgot to tell you to put this. See, now it's on them, not on me. So that's how I go about doing it. Agent remarks will be just for you to fill in anything that the agent needs to know, but the client or buyers don't need to know. Directions or non-standard address. The only time you're going to use this is if you try to pull up the property on your maps on your phone and it doesn't take them to the property, fill in how to find the property. I'll give you an example. I sold a cabin up a Big Cottonwood Canyon a few years ago that if you plugged in the address into your phone, your GPS, it would drive you to one of the neighboring cabins. So I use this non-standard address to just explain, hey, it's going to get you to the cabin and you got to go around the corner to find the house or whatever. So that's what that's going to be for. Pretty rare that you need to use that, but occasionally it'll be in a scenario, like I said, where that cabin up the canyon. Exclusion remarks, we already talked about. Best thing is don't have it in the property if you can, but if there are things, you would list them there. And HOA remarks, just whatever they would need to know. All right, next, seller disclosures. When we get to seller disclosures, here's what I tell the clients. These forms, the seller disclosure forms, are going to be the most important forms you fill out in this whole transaction. And I always tell the seller, if you end up in court, what we've done on the other contracts could play into it to some extent, but the one that's going to set you free out of court, it's your get out of jail free card from Monopoly, is your seller disclosures. Here's the problem. Typically, when a seller fills these out, they're worried about disclosing information that's going to make the house look bad, or that the buyer's going to now come back and try to get lower price because of it. But here's what I found. Anything you disclose on here, essentially, the buyer could never sue you for it. Now, that's not saying they won't, but technically, if you've disclosed it here, what's going to happen is this. So I'm going to give you two different scenarios with this. The first one was, I have an attorney friend of mine that he was selling his house in Farmington. And somehow he found out the buyers were not going to do a home inspection. And so he told me, I refilled out my seller disclosures once I found out they were not going to do a home inspection. And he said, I checked yes on almost every single thing on the seller disclosures, and then just put a note explaining what it was. Like, for example, what he told me is stucco. It said, are you aware of any, I can't remember the wording on stucco here. I guess we could look it up. But basically, he put on there, check yes, and just put there's cracks in the stucco. And he did that for almost every single one of the items. And I asked him why. And he said, because if they end up in court over this, a judge is going to look at it and say, they told you they were aware of problems with the stucco, that there were cracks. Why did you not check it out in more detail? See, notice the tendency a seller wants to put no on everything. Nope, there's no problems, no problems. Yet, if there is a problem, when they end up in court, a judge is going to look at it and say, wait a minute, you were aware and you didn't disclose. Now, I'm not telling you this to have you be like, you should tell your sellers to check yes on everything. I'm not saying that. But I am saying if they're aware of something, then they should. So I had somebody call me recently, and I can't remember which section it was on. Oh, it was on about meth. Because they said their client had bought the home and it had meth, but they had it cleaned up before they bought it. They're now selling it, and they were saying, do we need to disclose it? Well, the answer was no, because, let me see, where's it at? See if I can find this section. I can't remember where it was at. But the way that it was worded was, are you aware of anything since you bought the property is what it was. I don't know where that's at that I was reading it, but basically it just said, are you aware of it since you owned the property? And the answer was no, I'm not aware of it since they owned it. So you didn't have to. So only just answer the question, are you aware? And if the answer is yes, tell them to check yes. Because here's the thing. So let me give you, I've only had one transaction in 25 years, knock on wood, that ended up in court. I've had one time. And the scenario was the buyer was suing the seller saying that they didn't disclose to them that there had been water in the basement, that they weren't aware of it. Well, I went to my back, and it had been a few years since the thing had closed. I went back into their seller disclosures, pulled it out, and noticed that they had disclosed that there had been water in the basement. So we went to court, and I was just there for moral support, but we went to court, and the client showed up. I gave him the copy of the seller disclosures and said, present this to the judge. It was small claims court. They got there, they gave it to the judge. The judge looked at it and said, now, Mr. Buyer, you're suing saying that they didn't disclose to you that they had water in the basement. He says, I've got these seller disclosures right here that show that they tell you that they did. Were these your initials? Yeah. So then the judge said, why are we here? Because they told you. And he said, well, but the tree root branches grew into the sewer and it backed up and made this big mess. And they didn't tell me that there were tree roots going to grow into the sewer. And luckily the judge lived in an area that he said, that happens in my neighborhood to somebody on my street every year. Welcome to home ownership. Like, they're not going to know when that's going to happen. This is stupid, and threw it out. So ultimately, just keep in mind, I always tell the seller, disclose. Now, one question for you guys. What if they did this? What if they said, and I'm going to just use a really stupid example. What if they said to you, and I want you guys to answer this, should I disclose that we had this mark on the wall? I don't know if you guys can see it very well, but should I disclose it? What's the answer?
I would say
No,
no.
because they can see the mark.
It's not
Okay.
material.
So good. I like where you guys are thinking is it, and in what you're saying is in essence correct, meaning they can see it, so you technically shouldn't need to disclose it. My answer is,
When in doubt, disclose.
yep, I don't care what they say to me after should I disclose. If they say to me, should I disclose this? Now, if they didn't ask me, I'm never going to point out, hey, you should disclose that. But if they said to me, should I disclose that? My answer is yes, you should. Because what I don't know is there more to that question that they're not telling me? Is there something going on behind here that's creating that mark in the wall that I'm not aware of, that they are? But see, they'll say, should I disclose it? And if you say no, and then there is something going on behind there that they were aware of and you were not, and they didn't disclose it, if they end up getting sued, they're going to blame it on you and say, I asked you if I should disclose it, and you said no. So to me, what? Go ahead.
Sorry, I've got a question with that then. So I have a listing here in Eagle Mountain where we were under contract with a cash offer. We were going forward. They did a home inspection, and the home inspection revealed that there were a couple of items of concern, but the buyers didn't want to disclose what they got on the report. They just told us one out of the few things that they saw, and they were unwilling to give us that report. So everything is like hearsay over the phone. At what point does that become material, and do we need to put that in the disclosures? I know it's safer if we do it now, but I mean, this is all alleged without us having the report in hand. So
Yeah.
what
Great
what do we
question.
do?
So what's the one thing they did tell you?
They told us that the water heater, the slope for the gas that comes out to go out of the property is sloped incorrectly. And so we were going to put that on there just because there's no reason not to.
Yeah.
And it's not too expensive to fix. But I mean, they had mentioned some other things with the electrical, but the homeowner's an electrician, but they didn't tell us exactly what. And so that's why it's like, okay, well, what do we disclose and what don't we? Because we don't have the report and they're not willing to give it to us, even though the cancellation has been drafted.
Yeah. So if they didn't give you any details on it, and when I say details, if they even just said electrical, if they didn't give you beyond that, meaning like there was a problem in the panel or something, if they told you something like that, I would say get the seller to have an electrician look at it. But where what you're saying is the seller is an electrician,
Right.
if the seller is an electrician licensed and says, that's fine how it is, then I would say, yeah, I probably wouldn't worry about it. Now, the flip side of that is, again, I just say to me, here's how I would present it to the seller. If you're at all worried that somebody may come back later on and sue you and it is all of a sudden discovered that these people found out about it and it really was an issue, then I would say disclose,
Okay. Yeah. My only issue with it is if we had the paperwork in front of us, I'd be like, okay, I disclose everything that was found.
Yeah.
But we don't have anything. It's all hearsay. It could be just whatever. And I don't even know why they told us if they weren't willing to give us the report when they
Right.
drafted the cancellation. Like,
Yeah,
you
that's just, if it's stuff that they're, like I say, if they just said, oh, there's something with the electrical, there was some stuff with the electrical, and you said, well, what is it? And they said, well, we don't want to disclose that. Okay. I mean, at that point, again, I go back to, you just have to answer the question of, to your knowledge, are there any whatever? And if to their knowledge there is, then you should say yes. If to their knowledge, no, then go with no.
awesome. Thank you.
Okay, yep. All right. Did I beat up the seller disclosures enough? So the last thing that I'm going to hit on then with seller disclosures, and then we'll go on to the next, is this. Down here is where the sellers are going to sign under this verification by the seller. The acknowledgement, the buyer just is signing, acknowledging. Sometimes buyers will be worried, well, if I sign it, that means I agree to what they said. No, you're just acknowledging you got a copy. But then there's a disclosure form update section. So depending on when the seller fills this out, they should then also do an update on this. Now, ultimately, you could even argue if they filled it out yesterday and you got an offer that you needed to send this off today, you technically probably should have them check there are no changes. Because is it possible that they said, nope, there's never been a leak in the property today, and they sign it, and then tonight they go home and the basement floods? Yeah. So technically, you probably should always have them do this. But for sure, I would say if any amount of time goes by, have them update it and either say there are changes or there are not, and sign it. Okay. And then this is the addendum to that. If they need more room to, to say page, whatever, item number, here's the explanation. What I have found is if they check yes and can put, here's what we did about it, the buyer's not going to have an issue. But again, even if they put what they did to fix it, they're never going to be able to get sued by it. And I say never, I mean, they could, but they got a much better chance of winning in court because the judge is going to look at it and say, they told you they have this problem. Even though they said they fixed it, why didn't you check it out? Why didn't you look? So that's what I got to say about it. All right, next, wire fraud alert disclosure. So on this is with less worrisome for a seller on this, but always good to just explain to them there's a lot of wire fraud going on. If you get any emails or notifications telling you to wire money somewhere, don't do it without verifying it. Because if you wire money to a fraudulent account, it's gone. And then just have them sign that you've explained it. Okay? Next, the affiliated business arrangement disclosure, which I need to see. We probably have an updated one. I haven't seen it yet though, so I don't know. But prior to a few weeks ago in Utah, we only had Inspiro Financial, but we now have a title company as well. Northwest Title, Northwest, is that the name of it? No, what's North Star? Like, couldn't remember the name of our title. North Star Title. Northwest is the one that my buddy used to own that got sued. So North Star Title. So that will get added to this as well. Essentially what you're having your client sign this. And I just want to point out that it has in bold, you are not required to use the listed providers as a condition of settlement. And there are frequently other settlement service providers available with similar services. They're free to shop around. Some agents freak out about, I'm not having my client sign that because what if they're not going to use Inspire or they're not going to use North Star? That's fine. Because Everest has an ownership in those companies, they just have to, your client has to sign that they know that that is the case. Whether they use them or not is up to them and doesn't matter. All right, last form and then we're done. Guess I didn't need to speed up as fast as I did, but you're grateful that I did anyway, right? All right, next. Lead-based paint disclosure. So here's the question. Put it in the chat box or unmute. When do we need to use this? On properties built when?
1978 or older, unless there's been paint, but it's always better to disclose.
No, it's property built prior to 1978.
All right,
That's
so I've got 1978 or older or prior to. Which one is correct?
Prior to.
What about the rest of you? Give me an answer. Throw in the chat box, say something.
According to the form, it's prior to 1978, but I always just err on the side of caution.
It never hurts to err on that. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, so the law is prior to 19. So if the property was built in 78, you do not need it. But I also would agree it's not going to ever hurt. In fact, I've done a lot of bank-owned properties, and the banks, even if the property was built last year, throws in a lead-based paint disclosure. I don't think we need to be that cautious of it that the banks are. The reason they do it is because they don't really know and they're not in town to know. But prior to 78, you need to use it. If it was 78 or newer, you do not need it. So in terms of filling this out, what you're going to do is there's a checkbox here. That is not a checkbox. It should be an initial. Have them initial that if they know of lead-based paint or they have no knowledge. The seller is also going to initial that they have provided the buyer with the information if they have it, or they have no reports. So they're going to initial one of these two boxes, one of these two boxes. Then the buyer is going to initial all this, and we'll talk about that next week in the buyer class. And the listing agent, you're going to initial here, and then everybody signs. Now this should be uploaded as part, get it filled out and uploaded to your listing so that the buyers can just download it prior to doing the offer. Because technically, the way the law is written is it should be disclosed before they make the offer. Most of the time people do it as part of an offer. Before it was on the MLS, they would do it after an offer. But technically it should be done before, which is why the MLS allows us to put it there before when we list the property. Questions? All right. Time to wake up then. The class is over. And thanks for being here. So next Tuesday is going to be the CMA class. So we're going to go through and talk about how to do a CMA. And I'm going to do a CMA, walk you through the process that I use on the CMA. And thanks for being here. That's all I got for you today.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Thanks, guys.
So Russ, I've got a couple of questions. This is Rebecca.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was hoping that you'd be going through maybe some things that you put into a seller's packet with our 21 online resources and things. Is that something that you know, a lot of agents will put in different things, and so you're just going through the major documents, but I just wanted to get some suggestions on seller packet inputs.
Okay, so here's kind of, I guess, what I would recommend on that. So yeah, the idea of today's class is just about the required forms, the minimum required forms. There might be others, but minimum, you're gonna need these ones.
Right, and I love your your classes, but I need, I don't need help on,
Sure.
obviously, on those types of things, although I love gleaning ideas from you. You're great.
Sure, thank you. So
Um,
what I recommend on what you're referring to would be if you go on 21 online so in fact, I'll just bring it up and show you. So let me,
Well, and I've done it and I've been there, but I get pretty frustrated on 21 online with different things, and with trying to direct traffic to a different website of mine and things like that. And I'm not sure who to turn to, but that's outside the seller packet.
yeah, that's
Um,
not what I'm talking about. Let me show you. So as far as the seller packet stuff, let me show you. On 21 online, we've got Toolkit CMA. So let me show you what I would recommend for you. Once you get into, and you can just always at the top here, you could type in Toolkit CMA, and then you can go to it that way. I usually just go here and go to Productivity Hub and then
okay,
scroll down.
okay.
And then right here is create presentation. So this is what you're asking about, is let me show you on here. What I would recommend that you do is you can do create a presentation, choose the listing presentation here, create new, and then here's all the forms that are available to you. What I would recommend that you do is just come in here and click on like this cover letter and see if you like it. And if you do, check the box to use it. If you don't, uncheck it to get rid of it. And then here's a checklist. What does it take to sell a property? Here's a checklist for you. If you like it, check the box. If you don't,
Right.
uncheck. So I would just recommend if you go through here, you can look at all these. I mean, there's like 88 or something. Just decide which ones you would want to use. And then you just go to next and you can create it and print that out. And then that's where you're going to get that kind of stuff that you're referring to.
Anything beyond that? I mean, I know you can upload a resume, you can do things like that. I actually have done that on that listing presentation, but I just was looking for ideas, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's outside of that, I don't know. That's for me, this is where I would go get other things to put in a packet for a seller.
Well, like business stats for the company, things like that, marketing things.
You know what, actually on that, I believe actually Danette created some of that stuff. So I would ask Danette in
Oh,
marketing,
yeah,
give an email to
okay.
her or give
I
them a
appreciate
call.
that.
Yeah, I think she does have that.
Because there's some really great marketing pieces I've seen floating past, and I'm like, where do I get that? Where do I get that? Even marketing things on how to market your home during COVID and stuff like that.
Yeah, check with
So,
Danette. I think she has-
okay, all right, I appreciate that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Have a
All
good
right.
day.
Hey, can
Bye.
I ask you a question real fast?
Yeah, go ahead, Phil.
So I've added a few people to my sphere of influence, and I need to send out an email to them. I just don't know what I should be adding into that email.
So say more. What do you mean?
So in your classes, when you say work in your sphere of influence, we need to contact them by email once a month and phone by once a month. I just don't know what to include in that email. Like,
Okay, gotcha. So for me, what I typically recommend on that is I would recommend go to, if you, have you got them in Zap?
yeah,
Best thing to do is go down in Zap in their contact info, go down to the home value updates and
Uh-huh.
put in your home address, and then it'll do it for you.
oh, cool.
That's the best thing. Outside of that, if you want, really outside of that, anything you come across, like 1 month, you could just send them an email of, hey, here's what rates are. It's a great time to be buying. Elections now, sort of over. And who knows what's going to happen? Jump on, get a rate locked in now, something like that. Putting some information about, like even just that thing I was just showing from 21 online, a seller checklist. Go in and send that as a copy of, hey, here's a checklist. And at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter what you send.
Mhm.
Just get in front of them. But for me, I found the very best is that home value updates.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
There's some really great resources on, every time you get the board letter or NAR on the NAR website, but I love what you're saying
Yeah.
through Zap. So, hey, thanks, appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. See ya.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Today I sent out some motion for outdoor space.